Today I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Coe Ridge settlement and another one of those lost tribes of Appalachia, the Black Coes, or the native people who lived up here atop the ridge. Unlike Melungeons, they were very obviously majority African American, the descendants of slaves who had populated the ridge up here in several different families. Early legends claim that Coe Ridge was a mix of freed slaves, Native American holdouts that had avoided relocation, and, quote, a stray white woman whose name is lost to the Coes. Another brief legend spread in the Great Depression is that these were mainly Native holdouts with very little black blood among them, which is entirely untrue. Then one day in 1798, one of the women that John Coe had enslaved gave birth to two beautiful children in her cabin. John Coe saw their skin color and, remarking that it was copper-toned, said that these must be the children of his slave with a Native American holdout. Now, one of these was Betty, another was Suki. Betty, again born 1798, would eventually have Ezekiel in 1817. Apparently, Betty and Suki both had consent of the slave master, John Coe, to have an unknown white father, probably John himself, at a very young age. There were several other kids than Zeke, but they were 1/4 black, 1/4 Indian, and 1/2 white. One of Zeke's brothers, a man named Riley, was known as Bright, skin too light so that he wouldn't accept the role of slave, but wouldn't fit into black society. So they sold him to a harsher plantation in the Deep South. And this was to leave a lasting impact on young Zeke Coe. Now, the white patriarch of the Coe family, John Coe, moved from North Carolina here to southern Kentucky and brought all of the enslaved workers with him. John Coe was considered a very tough man, but his son Jesse was viewed very positively by the Black Coes, who even said he allowed them to marry for love, which was unheard of at the time, and refused to separate the families. In 1854, his son, Jesse Coe, took over the operation of the farm. Now, because it was illegal to simply free the slaves, he allowed them to live freely on his property and have a degree of independence, to the point where, by the time the Civil War came around, Union bushwhackers would often enter the area and hold guns up to the heads of people like Ezekiel Coe and demand they turn in where the Coe family lived, the white Coe family, and Zeke said, shoot, shoot, that's all you're good for. This is a fascinating later newspaper article that shows the mansion of Coe Ridge owned by Thomas or E. Coe, their chief. Big Six Henderson was the revenuer and treated them with the utmost of respect, hiding right next to their stills and jumping out when they chuckled to each other, wonder where Big Six is today. He respected them, and in return, they respected him back. Whenever arrested, they didn't even need to be jailed and would reliably walk to the trial, even if they had to make the distance dozens of miles. Big Six Henderson is something of a legend in and of himself. His Find a Grave profile has a review saying, quote, you caught my grandpa and gave him a break. God bless Big Six. His father, George Washington Henderson, served in the Union Army and was a survivor of the Andersonville prison camp. Now, the mother here is Betty Coe. It says she was born 1798 in North Carolina, and the father was Master Stove, a Cherokee, Native American. I wonder what the source is for this. And apparently Betty and Suki were born of different fathers, because here it says that Suki had a child to Master Lynch, apparently a white man, because the Master Stove was denoted as a Cherokee Native American under the marker for Ezekiel Coe, who was born of Betty in 1817. And I had no idea that there was an annual reunion of the Coes that was held just up the road here, but it seems like they have facilities built just for it. Now, this sign reads, in 1866, after the Civil War, Ezekiel and Patsy Coe founded Coe Colony, also known as Zeketown. The family members lived on the 1,500-acre Coe Ridge and thrived on logging, farming, and rafting the Cumberland River for almost 100 years. The Black Coes were proficient moonshiners, and over 100 unmarked graves remain. Now, there are no marked graves for Patsy and Zeke Coe, but they are memorialized right here. And I'd also like to point one more thing out. And that's the fact that oral histories would suggest Patsy and Zeke didn't escape from the Coe family. In reality, after the death of the brutal slave master John Coe, his son Jesse took over, was actually very kind to the people on the farm, and eventually sold Zeke Coe the 300 acres up here on the ridge, which eventually grew to be 1,500 acres. In fact, Patsy and Zeke could have moved up here sooner, but continued living on Jesse Coe's property until 1867. And for over 20 years, they lived peacefully as a community atop the ridge, which drew in white women fleeing abusive relationships, which drew in other Africans who were incapable or just unable to make their way up north for work in places they would be more accepted. And the outside world more or less forgot about these folks until the Taylor brothers came along, a brutal and merciless gang of men who wanted to wipe the community out completely. It doesn't get much more idyllic than this. We're here on the southern edges of Cumberland County, Kentucky, on the Tennessee border, and as we pan around through the creek bed here, you can see a road, Zeketown Road, leads up to Coe Ridge, or P Ridge. We're going to go see the Coe Ridge Cemetery and talk about the Coe Ridge people, a beautiful sort of mixed race, multi-ethnic group similar to the Melungians, descended from emancipated slaves who chose to continue living in the local area and making a living for themselves as a sort of community of people who wanted to live on the fringes of society. The notorious Taylor brothers were hated by black and white alike on both sides of the Kentucky-Tennessee state line, and they hatched up their harebrained idea at none other time than the 4th of July, 1888. Their plan was to ride into the community on horseback, execute the elderly Zeke Coe, and then proceed to kill the rest of his family. Bill Taylor is nothing short of an absolute coward, and I say this because he and his two buddies came up to Coe Ridge to start trouble, and eventually the elderly couple that controlled the settlement sent their young son, Calvin, to go fetch some food from the Wilburn cabin, and as soon as Calvin had turned his back, Taylor decided to start shooting at him. That's when Calvin swiveled around, snatched his gun before he could even know what happened, and immediately Pruitt, Taylor's friend, started trying to de-escalate everything. He said, "We're not here to cause any trouble. We're just here to, I don't know, rough you around a little bit and then we'll be on our way." Well, nobody knew that Short was still hiding behind the corner, so he tossed a revolver up to Taylor, and Taylor immediately shot and wounded some of the Coes, but immediately the elder Wilburn fell, dying, and Wilbur was just trying to get some food from out of his cabin to feed these three gangsters. After fatally wounding and leaving Olson Wilburn to bleed out on the ground, Taylor raised the gun and took a couple shots at Patsy and Zeke Coe, and one of the shots actually passed through the elderly woman's hair. Realizing that Calvin Coe would want blood, he swiveled around and took aim at the guy, but the elderly Zeke Coe threw a rock at Taylor and spoiled his aim. Immediately, Calvin was on top of Taylor and slit his throat ear to ear. Meanwhile, Short mounted his horse and escaped on horseback down the hill here with a bullet in his thigh. So Bill Taylor died a bastard's death and was buried in the local cemetery the following night. Meanwhile, Short fled like a coward, and Pruitt was left standing there frantically explaining that he didn't want any more violence and wasn't privy to the plot to kill anybody. He just thought they were coming up there to rough them up. Eventually, they decided to let Pruitt go because it seemed like he was telling the truth, and Calvin, the son of Patsy and Zeke, turned himself in to the sheriff, saying that it was a clear-cut case of self-defense. And sure enough, it was ruled a case of self-defense, and that's something that was nearly unheard of in the 1880s. The Coes were off the hook for murder, but a lot of people in the local area couldn't stand the thought of this, so a posse quickly formed. A lynch mob. Not long afterwards, 24 local men, most of them moonshiners or supporters or relatives of the Taylor brothers, decided to descend on this community. However, before they even made it up to Zeketown, they were fired on from the ridge and quickly beat a path to the exit. 4 years would pass until George Taylor decided to mount his horse alone on election night and drive up to Zeketown to kill Calvin Coe, who he knew drew the knife over his brother's throat. He was acquitted of of the crime by reason of self-defense, but he couldn't stand it, particularly because every one of his other brothers had been killed in violent confrontations in Kansas and Missouri. Right now, it was just George left, so he decided to walk up behind Kelvin Coe, who's buried right back here, and shot him twice in the back. Once, which would make him fall over, and then as he crawled away, another shot fired into his back. Now, Kelvin actually survived this incident, and immediately George Taylor was filled with dozens of bullets from every angle. Now, from their founding in 1867 until these murders in the 1880s and early 1890s, these were the only incidents of violence, but because the Coes had defended themselves so well, they gained a reputation in the local community, and people began to spread legends about them that were unfairly deserved. Kelvin Coe's name comes up again and again in this story, and in 1954, a revenuer explained that a white woman with a name lost to the Coes, which I don't believe at all, I believe this was Judea, gave them many children. I believe that the father of these children was Kelvin Coe. Now, unlike other Melungians, he was said to only be 5'2", 125 pounds. Melungians usually live to be rather tall, especially the Carmel Indians. However, he made up for it with the fact that he was the best fighter around. In fact, there was a feisty jailer who was a little bit rough with him, and when he pulled a revolver, Kelvin is said to have disarmed him and pinned him by the neck to the bars of the cell until he calmed himself down. He actually had to disarm another jailer who ran up to rescue the first one, and both men were pinned there in the arms of a 5'2", 125-pound man. The same revenuer, explaining the story of the Coes to the papers in 1954, claimed that the woman's name was Jane Scott and that she was eventually taken by local police and died in jail of tuberculosis, which might explain a little more clearly why Kelvin swore vengeance to anybody who would come to his community to take the people who loved them away. This was something very personal. He lost his wife, a woman who'd probably given him at least 7 or 8 children. His wife, Judea, kept the last name Scott because nobody would marry an interracial couple back in the day, but it was from these two and from the relationships that Kelvin had with others around the community, because apparently he had more than one wife, that grew the Coe Ridge clan to the size that it became. In the back of the cemetery here, we have Kelvin Coe and very likely his wife, Judea, who was white and kept the last name Scott because, again, they weren't allowed to be married. One of the reasons the Coe Ridge people were never talked about is because interracial relationships were such a taboo topic in the American South, especially during the Jim Crow era. And the fact that Judea was willingly in this relationship, along with quite a few other white women apparently, was too much to even discuss, especially in a rural county along the Cumberland River. It's not known with any certainty how many children Judea and Kelvin Coe had, but one of them is buried here. That would be Fanny Coe, who died in 1909, age only 19 years old. Very young, probably from a disease. And I would say that because she's buried right next to several other graves of people who died early in the early 1900s, because diseases would sweep through small rural communities like this. Although it's unknown for sure how many children the couple had, some of them moved to Monroe County, Kentucky, where they're now buried. That would be Arthie Coe Long and Sarah Frances Coe Tooley, and she's got a beautiful photo on Find a Grave. George Casco, another handsome son of Kelvin and Judea, was buried at age 60 in Indianapolis, where he'd followed the majority of the Coe clan after they fled around the time of the Great Depression. I'd like to say a word about Kelvin Coe yet again because of an article published in the Columbia News in 1910 titled Coe Negroes Again on Rampage. This article reads, "A correspondent of the Cincinnati Enquirer writes as follows concerning trouble in Cumberland County. The Coe Negroes, who have gained such a nefarious reputation in a feud which has existed for more than 20 years, and in which more than a score have been murdered, are now on the warpath again, and bloodshed is almost sure to follow. These Negroes have been a terror to the citizens and officers of Cumberland County for 23 years. Recently, officers learned that Cal Coe and other Negroes were living with white women unlawfully, and Determining to break it up, they went to Coe Ridge and arrested Cal Coe and other Negroes and 2 white women and placed them in jail. This step on the part of the officers raised the ire of the Negroes, and after being released from jail, Coe swore vengeance against everyone who in any way had anything to do with his arrest. The Burkesville Banner, edited by S.A. Carey, printed a short article of the arrest using no names, and for this he has been warned that he will be shot on sight. This article pretty clearly illustrates that many white women were living openly with black men up on Coe Ridge and cohabiting with them. Now, if you are to believe the oral histories, you would learn that most of these women were fleeing abusive relationships from their white husbands down in the valley. Articles published decades later would point out that there was no long-standing feud and that for decades there was peace on this ridge, only broken when outsiders decided to do the breaking themselves. I mean to say that there were no Hatfield and McCoy type feuds, but the extent of the fighting here was passed down in oral histories, and for the most part not officially recorded, because any violence that resulted was greatly exaggerated by papers throughout the state of Kentucky. Now, in May of 1920, William Long, a white man, was found in Zeketown with 4 bullets in his head. Papers vaguely referenced feuds among the black families and claimed that the Coe, Wilburn, and Zeke clans occasionally fought and all were kin. Now, this is already a misstatement because Zeke was the first name of the community's founder. There was no Zeke clan here. Now, apparently, at least according to the article, Will Long had testified against some people in the community and spent a bit of time up here, which is just something you wouldn't necessarily do unless you came up here to buy moonshine, which is pretty much all the community could do to raise money. After all, the crops didn't really grow very well here. His brother Garfield Long was later arrested and questioned about the murder of his own kin, and as the case fizzled out, white residents began to harass the community. The Coes apparently responded by leaving threatening notes and sticks of dynamite around town, and for this, the whole community of Zeketown was raided. And that raid happened on February 26, 1921. Apparently, an army of lawmen and revenuers marched up this road right to the center of Zeketown and dragged every single inhabitant off in chains. The article says that they are, quote, lawless descendants of an Indian squaw who once lived here. You can see from the embellishment in articles like this that the community, generally speaking, disliked them on the outside, but they had plenty of friends actually inside of Cumberland County. Not all news about the Coe Ridgers was negative. In fact, an April 1928 article published in the Breckenridge News reads in part, 8 years ago, they were brought before Judge Smith on the same charge of moonshining, and in recalling the incident last week, he remembered that on that occasion, they had promised the officers that they would appear on the set day for trial without officers and without food. When the appointed day arrived, Bob Coe was there and on time, though he had walked 42 miles and waded a creek. Again, last week, keeping a promise they had made government officers, these men without bond again appeared before Judge Smith. They had never been forcibly taken by law. Quote, we will not submit to arrest, they declared, but we will give you our word that we will be in Glasgow on April 9th. This they did. The following conversation followed between Smith and the leader of the accused men. Bob, you promised me 8 or 10 years ago that you would quit making and selling liquor, Judge Smith reminded one of the leaders. I did, Judge, he answered. It was 8 years ago last February, and I meant to keep my promise, Judge. But our land is thin, and we have 150 mouths to feed, and it just looks like we can't dig it out of the ground. I just don't know what to do, but I promise you I will never be before you again, Judge. You have always been good to us. For a number of years, this remarkable family have lived alone on the crest of the ridge which bears their name. It has been a life of continual feuds for many of them. More than 20 lives have been taken in the various affrays in which they have engaged. They have resided outside interference and have resisted it bitterly. They do not wish to have trouble with the outside world and do not run when trouble enters the camp. Now, the defendant mentioned in that short 1928 article was Robert Coe, the father of Laura Beatrice Coe, who married Frank Otley Coe, the son of E., the leader of the Coe family. Now, one of those families that made their mark on this ridge and might have actually had a small-scale feud was the McMillan family. And I say this because they have no marked gravestones, and yet quite a few are said to be buried in this cemetery. They are married into by a woman named Emma Anders, who married Johnny McMillan, probably the grandson of a Tom McMillan, who was born in 1865. After Emma died at age 27, he fled to Indiana, and unlike the McMillan clan, some of the Anders siblings are buried here, like her brothers Ray and Albert, or her sisters Hattie and Annie. Although he's buried in Indiana, her brother Ernest has beautiful photos. He has the typical look of somebody who came from the Coe Ridge settlement. Some recent burials from the Anders family: Judge W. Anders, who only died 4 years ago. And probably the most recent burial, Mammy Joyce Coe, who only died a few months ago. So Zeketown was named after Zeke Coe, and it seems like Zeke had a few children. One of these children was Thomas E. Coe. They just called him E for short. He was named after his grandfather and was one of the last leaders of the people up on Coe Ridge. So far, I haven't been able to find his grave. It's probably unmarked because most folks who lived up here were illiterate, but this is the grave of his son, Frank Otley Coe, who only died in 1965, 100 years after the end of the Civil War. And because some accounts say he's buried next to his father, I would suspect the headstone over here with flowers on it is probably the final chief of the Coe Ridge people, E. Coe. Assuming this is the grave of the Coe Ridgers' last chief, I want to point out that his son is buried next to him, but his daughter, Dimple Lee Ashley, married into the Ashley family, moved and only died in 2014. She's now buried in Indiana. I can't even begin to imagine how proud Frank Coe must have been of his children. In fact, his son Lyle served in Korea, and his daughter Essie moved to Indiana. Just look at the photo that was posted when she passed away. She looks amazing for a woman in her 80s. Although perhaps he wasn't a chief of the Coe Ridge people because he wasn't a descendant of Zeke Coe, Oscar Holman was still a community leader and very well respected up until his death in 1944. He had quite a few influential children, including two who are buried here right next to him, both veterans of World War II. Esau Cole is buried on the right there under a military headstone, and Lonnie Holman was buried pretty recently in 2011. And Esau served in the 368th Infantry 93rd Division in World War II, dying in 1966. One of the most fascinating things about the Coe Ridge Cemetery is the fact that so many people insist on staying buried here. It's their family burial ground. They feel tied to the earth. And this is the case with Lonnie Holman, who died in 2011. And as we pan over here, we can see a newer monument that I didn't see on Find a Grave. And this goes to show exactly what I'm saying. Family generations coming together. It has the names of the different clans that settled here on Coe Ridge: Coe, Holman, Wilburn, Anders, Tooley, Kirk, Geralds. And the bottom, this is where it all began. Like many of the Coe clan, Charlie Coe decided to move up north for work. While many went to Indianapolis, he decided to go to Chicago, dying at age 71. In 1974, very sadly, he was killed by a hit-and-run driver. Charlie's offspring knew him as a hard-working family man, someone who put his nose to the grindstone to provide for his 5 sons and 3 daughters. The Wilburn family also left their mark up here on Coe Ridge. Charlie and Ernest Wilburn had a daughter named Virginia, or Tootsie Wilburn, who's buried here. One of the Wilburn children was Ebony Brittany Wilburn, a beautiful baby girl who died the day after she was born. And here's some more of the Wilburn family graves. One of the very recent graves in this cemetery at the very back is Giuseppe Donovan Shannon Norris, born 1989, died only 2020. And a very recent Wilburn burial from August 2023 is that of Buford Lewis Wilburn, who lived well into her 90s. This is the grave of Manda Coe, probably Amanda, born in the 1840s, although it says here on her tombstone it's not known exactly what date she was born, suggesting she was born into slavery and later emancipated. According to some info on her son Samuel's biography, she was Bill Coe's wife, Bill being the son of Ezekiel Coe, the founder of the colony here on Pea Ridge. After this, it was called Coe Ridge because their family grew in number very, very quickly, and they all looked up to Zeke for guidance. When the community began to slowly collapse and move away, many of her kids relocated to the north. Sam moved to Kansas and authored a short paper on the history of Coe Ridge. Martha moved to Detroit. John moved to Indiana with his sister Ada and many other Coes from the community. Many of Manda Coe's children have beautiful photos preserved for future generations and archived on Find a Grave, but one son is especially important to mention, that being Jesse Coe, who sort of drew the attention of the outside world to Coe's Ridge. That's because, along with many of his siblings, he moved to Indiana, and when he was being harassed by police, not used to the fact that they couldn't live independent, he shot back and killed 2 of them. Afterwards, he was killed in a shootout, but what followed, an incident with his sister, really raised an eyebrow in the local papers. The story that drew attention from all over Appalachia was the 1908 murder of Jesse Coe and how Jesse's sister Martha Cassie reacted to the murder. See, the state of Indiana refused to bury his body, so they sent it down to Glasgow, Kentucky to be buried in an unmarked plot at the Black Oddfellows Cemetery. However, his sister Martha was reportedly mentally unwell and had overheard people talking about plans to go and dig the body up and possibly put it on display, which I guess is just something that happened back in the early 1900s if you were considered a black desperado. So she grabbed her shotgun and for days, by the lantern light, stood guard at his grave, preventing any would-be body catchers, body snatchers, from taking the body of her brother. After this, she moved to Detroit and tried to mend things over with the authorities. 2 of the more beautiful and touching graves in the Coe Ridge Cemetery are Mary and her sister Ruthie Coe, age 18 and 20 years old. Ruthie, buried here on the right, was 20 when she died in late October 1918. Earlier in her life, she'd been brought in to provide testimony at a murder trial and remarked that she was about 8 years old when a man was killed up on the ridge, indicating that these people were by and large illiterate, but seeking to pass down their histories just by word of mouth, and her epitaph reads, "A perfect darlin'." And Ruthie's sister Mary Coe died the following day. She was only 18 years old. There are several headstones in this cemetery that have similar dates of death, showing that diseases swept through this community at times, especially during the colder months. An angel child. You can also find a beautiful photo of these 2 headstones in old newspapers when the outside world finally decided to start documenting the fascinating oral histories of the Coe Ridge people. There were several clans living up here on Coe Ridge. The Coes were the main one, but you also had the Anders, the Tooleys, the Kirks, the Wilburns, and here is the grave of Denton Tooley, who was married in 1925. Sadly, life quickly broke down on Coe Ridge, and so did their idyllic society, so after losing a bet to a man named The Geralds, he was stabbed, and he ran for the hills, The Geralds did. Denton was only 19 years old when he was murdered, and police soon captured The. Young Denton's wife, Hattie Kirkpatrick, continued using Kirkpatrick as her last name, even on their shared tombstone, in spite of the fact that they got a marriage license. I find this unusual, but then I look at the fact that quite a few Kirkpatricks are buried in this cemetery, and it's interesting that they took so kindly to their last names. They really had pride in the individual clans that they came from, and buried right there behind them is the leader of Coe Ridge at the time, Calvin Coe, the son of Zeke, who founded this colony. I've discovered in the course of my research that Hattie Kirkpatrick is actually a daughter of Ray Anders and would marry a Kirkpatrick after the death of her husband Denton Tooley. Her father was a community leader buried right over here who sort of led the Anders clan on Coe Ridge. While the community had an undisputed leader in Zeke Coe and later some of his descendants, the individual clans had leaders of their own. One of these was The Anders, who led his own kin and now lies in an unmarked grave. He was born in 1875 and had many kids that settled on this ridge. Hattie Anders, one of his daughters, married Denton Tooley, who was stabbed and killed in 1928. Every event like this rocked the community to its very bones. After Ray was born, Thea had Emma and Harlan Anders, who both died young of tuberculosis. Ray had 6 of his own kids and lived to old age, dying in 1989. Ray's own children mostly stuck around, and it looks like the Black Coes are still here, being buried in this community. One of Ray Anders' sons, Butch, revitalized life on Coe Ridge for a while. The papers called him Oil Baby Butch Anders because he owned a well, and the name stuck. That short article was printed in 1973. Butch's uncle Ernest lived to be nearly 100 and died in Indiana with the look of a Melungeon. I think most of the family stayed late, though, because Butch's money supported them. The oil really flowed and helped the community stay alive. Up here is the Coe Ridge Cemetery, and you can see here at the bottom of the hill, this place was probably used for moonshine for decades after the last of the Coes truly left. Newspaper articles from the 50s and 60s reported that only a few of them remained in the local area. They're still being buried here, but by that point they had all left. And this area is perfect for moonshining because clear, pure streams trickle down in a remote area that you can't really be seen from the road. And this is an old, probably long abandoned road leading up to the Coe Ridge Cemetery. I have no doubt that these are the foundations of a home leading up to the cemetery on top of the hill. It's kind of a square right around me. There's very little left up on Coe Ridge. Maybe a couple of areas of earth that are sort of dug out that show you that something used to be there. But we're on our way from Coe Ridge to the old community of Coe, and I just came across this pretty cemetery, the J.T. Spears Cemetery, sort of overlooking the idyllic valley, and there's a little cabin behind it as well. And in the Spears Cemetery, you've got Isaiah Dodson. And the Coe Ridge people were different from the Melungeons, but sort of tangentially related. I would suspect that he was a Melungeon here because he lived to be 110 years old. Here's 3 of the classic tent graves, sort of typical of the most rural parts of Appalachia. These are the Dodson family. And we're entering Monroe County right now, which is where the Coe family originally settled, the White family, when they came from the East Coast. This disused church overlooks the unincorporated community of Coe along the Cumberland River, which flows through the valley right over here. And it's here where John Coe and his sons, including Jesse, established themselves before the Civil War. By 1908, the Coe family was still very influential here in Cumberland County, but they decided to move to the county seat instead of on their plantation in the settlement of Coe over in Monroe County. They used a Sears Roebuck house, and they built it here in the shadow of the courthouse square. And just down the way, in the Burkesville Cemetery, a few of them are buried. One of them named after his grandfather, Jesse Coe. This house was recently sold, but as of 2018, it was on the market, and I'll give you a second to guess for how much. It was $129,000. And now it's in use, as far as I can tell, as a bed and breakfast, one room at least, and the rest of the house is used by the family that lives here. Yeah, once upon a time there was a sign right between these two, and it had a little history of the Coe family. It's always good to see homes like this staying preserved, but I wonder what could be done to help save the story of not only the white Coes, but of the black Coes, or the Pea Ridge people. Seems like for a while there were some murals over here, and I know from the historic marker database that there used to be some writing over on the opposite side of this wall. And some of the white Coes, the descendants of John and Jessie Coe, are buried in Burkesville, the county seat. That includes John H. Coe, who died in 1932. So John Coe and his son Jesse are buried up at the Coe plantation back in the woods. They haven't been able to find their cemetery, but Jesse's grandson, also named Jesse after himself, is buried right here. And he had two boys that served in the Great War, making his family proud, Herschel and Fred. And this is the grave of Fred Coe, who served in Battery D, 51st Artillery in the Great War. And he's buried here next to his wife, Helen. He died in 1970. And this is Jesse's other son, Herschel D. Coe, who served in the Army for World War I, living almost until 1980. He's buried here, sort of in the shadow of his father, right here. We've come out to the beautiful Chestnut Grove Cemetery in Cumberland County to tell the tragic love story of Mary Etta Flowers, who was murdered when she was 22 years old. And I believe that this ties in with the Coe Ridge community and with the people living atop Pea Ridge. Mary Flowers seems to have had the Melungeon look. Curly black hair, olive-colored skin. She came from a large family in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, but whereas the Melungeons lived in northeastern Tennessee, the Coe Ridge people, or the Pea Ridgers, lived in the local area. And it was around 1921 that she fell in love and married a man quite a few years older than herself. She was only 16 at the time, named Ernest Spears. And look at that. A friendly dog came out just to say hello. Sometime after about a half-decade of being married to the man, she decided to flee up to Indiana, where she followed a man named Rez. If we're reading between the lines here, many of the Coe Ridge people left for Indianapolis and for Indiana or Detroit to go work in the factories because their economy had almost totally broken down here along the Cumberland River. They couldn't make a existence for themselves anymore and needed to move further north. So Ernest Spears traveled all the way up to Indianapolis to retrieve his young wife. She was in town. Mary told her friends that she had no intention of staying with Ernest and that her luggage would only make it as far as Burkesville, and she was going back. However, she might go back to Ernest's family to tell them goodbye before leaving, and it seemed like this was around the time that Ernest had formulated his plan to murder her. Ernest and Mary walked into a general store owned by Grady Spears. Again, the Spears clan was huge in this part of Cumberland County. Well, Grady always kept a .32 revolver under his desk to protect him in case of a robbery, and he noticed that the couple behaved strangely, and after they left, he found that his .32 was missing. Several people heard shots ring out from the woods, but the Spears family sort of protected each other. That is until Henry Flowers came around. Henry knew his daughter was back in the county and immediately went to the home of her husband. However, it seemed like Ernest was pretty disinterested in the whole affair and said he hadn't seen her. But pretty soon, a woman walked up to the father and said, "Well, you might want to keep looking." And she referenced the buzzards that were flying overhead, hinting very strongly that she'd probably been murdered. Henry, feeling unnerved, fled the local community and reported this to the police, who immediately began a search. And this is the actual location of Mary Flowers' murder. She was killed by Ernest Spears right here over the fence line of the Spears' cemetery and down in the ravine. Her body was discovered 3 days later by her brother John. Plenty of people lived up along the ridge and would have been able to hear the shots ring out that killed Mary, but many of them kept silent because they wanted to protect their own. One of the unusual facts that came out in the trial of Ernest Spears is the fact that two totally separate weapons were heard. Now, he stole that revolver from the general store of Grady Spears to cover the fact that he'd killed his wife, but to hear two separate weapons, including his own pistol, is a little unusual. Almost as soon as her brother John had discovered her body, the sheriff of Cumberland County summoned Henry Flowers and her husband, who was at that time still drunk. Realizing that Ernest had almost certainly killed the girl, the sheriff gave Henry Flowers a revolver and said that both men should stand there alone and say prayers. Flowers was too drunk to even realize what had happened. The sheriff gave Henry Flowers the option to kill the man that murdered his daughter, but Henry Flowers was a good Christian man and couldn't bring himself to do it. So after 30 minutes of not hearing a shot from the ravine, the sheriff came back to arrest Ernest Spears, and he would eventually be convicted for the murder of Henry's daughter. Ernest Spears lived only by the good graces of the father, sentenced to 21 years of hard labor. However, after serving only 10, the governor of Kentucky commuted his sentence, and he was released. He seems to have lived out the rest of his days at the bottom of a bottle, trying to forget what he'd done. Perhaps I'm reading too deeply into this, but many of the photos you'll find on Find a Grave show him looking very sullen. It looks like there's a look of guilt and regret in his eyes. Not much is known about Ernest Spears' military service because he never really spoke about it, but he does seem to have served in World War I, and by the time he married Mary Flowers, he was probably traumatized by the things he'd seen. The Spears had a very large family. Ernest's father, John Spear, was born in 1843 and is buried here right next to him. John's father, Ernest's grandfather, William Spear, was born in 1810 and is also buried in the local cemetery right next to his own father, Isaac Spear, right over here. Isaac Spear was born in 1784, right after the Revolutionary War. Settling here along the river with his wife Elizabeth, they were some of the earliest pioneer families in the Cumberland Valley.